We're going to get started. Well, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Andrea Sampson, the host and the moderator of our sense-making conversations. I'm also the CEO of Talk Boutique. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd love to hear from you all. This is a conversation after all. So I want to take a moment, first of all, and to find the chat bubble just below. Do you see the chat bubble in the Q&A? So I want you to locate those, and I want you to tell me that you're here by just typing one word into the chat bubble. So why don't you tell me where you're joining us from today? So just if it's from, if I'm here in Toronto, you might type Toronto, but you might also type my kitchen. It's up to you. Okay, let's have a look and see where people are coming from today. Oh, great. We've got Lynn here from Vancouver, Mary's from Ottawa, Billy Joe from Los Angeles. Oh my God, amazing. We've got Marcelina is here in Toronto. Juliette's calling in from Guelph. We've got people from all over. Thank you so much. Well, we are about a month into social distancing measures here in Canada, and it's hard to grasp the scale and the scope of the COVID-19's global impact, with over a third of the world's population under some sort of lockdown, and 185 countries have been affected. The number of new cases and deaths continue to grow exponentially. It's scary when we look out there. This is the news many of us are presented each morning as we check our devices or we look at those news sources. It can be challenging to stay positive and to stay focused on our lives and our careers. Add to this the fact that many of us are now working from home while homeschooling children or hoping to find a space of our own to just unwind. And of course, we're all worried about the toll this is taking on our economy. So today, I want to talk a little bit about how to prevent a second epidemic of mental health and social problems. And our expert, Dr. Sherry Walling, is going to give us some practical and candid ways to protect ourselves, our families, and our colleagues from the psychological toll of our current challenge. Dr. Sherry is practical and down to earth. So I know you're going to get a few new strategies. Dr. Sherry Walling is one of the world's only clinical psychologists focused on mental health of entrepreneurs and the self-employed. She has a unique mixture of elite research, training, psychotherapy experience, and time in the entrepreneurial trenches. Sherry helps smart people do hard things. Sherry, we're all feeling the heaviness and the uncertainty of the stress of living with the unknown. It's really emotionally wearisome, even to the toughest among us. Can you help us manage some of this load?
I can, I hope. I am happy to be joined by a couple of special friends. And this is Porg. This is a stuffed animal that is owned by my 9-year-old. And you can see that Porg is sporting his COVID-19 mask. And this is Jangler, who, it may be hard to tell, but Jangler is actually a brown fish who has a full hazmat suit sewn by child. So you can see the stitching here. And the reason that I bring these friends with me, oh, there's one more. This is a Lego creature who actually is also suffering from COVID-19. So he is in his treatment facility here. And the reason that I bring these creatures is because they are things that have been left around my home by my children who are, like many of us, trying to make sense of what's happening around them. So my kids are 13, 9, and 9, and they all have their kind of own developmental struggles and their own developmental gifts. And one of the things that they are doing is taking in the news, taking in what's happening, and then attempting to find ways to make sense of it, much like most of us. And I think that I appreciate finding these remnants around my house because it tells me that they're processing, right? They're working out their experience, their fears, their sense of need for protection through their play, which is, of course, the language of children. So if you're like me and you are a high achieving person who's used to doing lots of great things in the world, and now suddenly stuck at home, maybe not stuck, but home, and having the challenge of doing your job as well as taking care of kiddos who may be experiencing their own disruption, it is a tough time for particularly parents to thrive in the midst of all of these new challenges. I came across an article recently, someone posted on Facebook, and the title of the article was simply "The Parents Are Not Okay." And that it just landed so heavily with me because many of us who are raising children, of course, love our children, want to give them everything that they need and that they that is helpful to them, that helps them to be healthy and well. And right now, we're building or burning the candle at all ends, right? Trying to work, trying to find time to scramble through what work we have to do, as well as to be really present for kids who have different needs than they've ever had before. So when I think about the mental health impact of all of this, the first thing that I think about is simply the invitation to lower our expectations. Lower expectations of ourselves, lower expectations of our partners, lower expectations of our kids. And I know that might seem like an odd message in a time when we're asked to rise, to face a challenge. But the danger of being a high achieving person when you're confronted with a whole vast array of new challenges is that you may set yourself up for failure, and you may set yourself up for parenting in a way that's unhelpful because you're a little bit too ambitious. So I know that some of you high achieving folks have sat down and thought, okay, finally, I'm going to teach my 9-year-old to code, or I'm going to get my 12-year-old working on calculus. Like, your ambition as it relates to your children's education in this particular time in history may be counterproductive in a way that's actually quite painful for them and painful for you. So by lowering expectations, we're acknowledging that nothing about what's happening is business as usual. Nothing about what's happening is easy to digest or something that we can, just sort of muscle our way through. A lot of us are used to hustling. We're used to pushing ourselves. We're used to being highly organized. And that's not exactly the skill set that's going to be most helpful to us right now. So realizing it's not business as usual, and that there's an invitation to lower our expectations of ourselves and our kids, because that's what's actually the harder journey right now, the harder journey to pause, to be still, to be present. When we come to our tasks of our day, whether it's our work or our time with our children, with more presence and less hustle, we're going to do a lot better in terms of mental health outcomes in the long run. One of the things that's key to surviving in the world right now, as you're managing lots of different tasks and lots of different demands, is to have a flexible plan. And this, in our house at least, lives on a whiteboard in the kitchen, where hour by hour there's a guideline schedule for me, for my husband, for each of our children, so that we all sort of know where we're supposed to be at a given hour of the day. So the kids know which parent is available for questions, which parent is not available at a given time, and they all know exactly what they're supposed to be doing. And of course, this breaks down regularly, but at least it is a guide, it's a framework, because structure in the day, when kids are especially used to structure being in the context of school, it helps provide a sense of clarity about how to be successful in a given moment. When we are adrift in our days, and when we're adrift in our patterns and our habits, it's very easy to feel anxiety, to feel some depression and dissonance, and not just feel really unclear about how to be successful, how to win in the moment. So as we give structure to ourselves and our kids with a lot of flexibility, we're providing a framework in which kids can feel secure in what they're supposed to be doing. Of course, all of this takes a great deal of communication, right? Never before have our relationship's been so challenged with clear communication about what's needed, how to trade tasks, how to share things back and forth, how to even let kids know, hey, I have a webinar at 12:30 and I'm not available. Will you help me by being really quiet so I can focus? And asking for what we need, clearly articulating that for our children, for our significant other, and then also being available to show up for their needs in different ways than maybe we're used to. So this can look like a daily scrum meeting where everybody sort of gathers around who's got what going on today, what's exceptional in the day, what's normal, who's feeling a little off, is anybody feeling sick, is anyone feeling stressed. We kind of take a little inventory at the beginning of the day and then plan the day accordingly. And this also happens on a weekly basis where you look out over the week. My husband and I do this often. We've done this from before this epidemic happened, which is helpful to have the pattern in place. But to sit down on a Sunday and say, what do you need this week? Do you need some time with friends? Do you need time for a long run or a hike? Do you need time outside? What will help you to be successful in your emotional life, and how can I support that? So that open conversation between quarantined families is really important in helping us to all practice the self-reflective capacity to notice how I'm feeling, what I'm doing, what I need, and then to ask the people that we love for support around those needs. So never before has communication been so important in our families. I think one of the other things that I have been talking a lot with people about in the midst of this pandemic is the need for play, which I appreciate is probably really counterintuitive. It feels very, very serious right now. We're seeing the death toll climb every day. Many of us start our day with an awareness of all that is sad and scary and broken in the world right now. And I don't know of a better way to counterbalance that heaviness than with intentionally entering into spaces of lightness, spaces of imagination, spaces of creativity. These are, of course, the things that children most need for expression and for learning. But they're also things that we as adults need in ways that we maybe never have before. And that is the ability to let ourselves use some of this quarantine time to do things that really, really bring us deep joy. That might mean breaking out the guitar from college. It might mean working through a cookbook. It might mean taking an online painting class. It might mean setting up a garden. It might mean developing a distance running practice, a number of things that take us into our bodies, into some imagination, creativity, lightness, and ideally are things that we can engage in on the family level. So when we invite our children to play with us, to create something with us, and I don't mean sort of, sitting and watching our kids play, I mean really engaging in deep play alongside of them. So these are things that help to counterbalance that sense of dread, doom, and fear by sort of tilting the scale the other way and entering into some very intentional, different emotional space. Right alongside that, though, I think is also an invitation to, as families, as individuals, become more adept at the process of grief. Because when I hear all that is happening within us and around us, grief is the word that I hear most often, or most often sort of rings in my head, is that all of us are losing a lot. From the kiddo who's not going to get to do baseball season, or the young adult who isn't going to go to their high school or college graduation, to all the travel plans that I had this spring to attend conferences or be with friends. Grief is not only a word that refers to loss of life. Grief is a word that refers to anything that's lost, anything that we hoped for or loved that we no longer have access to. So that is all around us. And most of us are not very good at grief. Most of us are pretty good at pick myself up and keep marching on. And I think if nothing else, this quieter time of being home is a way to practice some grief, which means in our family, when my kids are sad about not being able to go down the street and play with their friends, or sad about trips they're not going to take, it's my parenting message isn't, oh, it'll be okay. My parenting message is, yeah, that's really sad. I'm super sad too. Like, we're living in an extraordinary time and there is some sadness. So how do you let yourself have some space for sadness? Let your children have some space for sadness and space for loss, while still continuing to move, continuing to grow, continuing to learn, letting life roll around with us. So I think there's really an invitation for deep emotional nuance and self-reflection in ways that, may be new to some of us. But I think if we want to counteract the threat of high anxiety, the threat of depression, we must develop a deeper capacity for empathy than perhaps we've had before. And that's the ability to be self-empathetic and then also to feel with people around us and to be sensitive to the deep emotional complexity that this pandemic and the quarantine, require of us. It's not as simple as how do you structure your day so you can get your work done and your kids don't bug you. It's how do you show up for yourself and for them in ways that are deep and true and meaningful and really helpful and supportive. So when we think about mental health kinds of things to watch out for, the nightmare scenario is that we have irritated, stressed out parents who are in their irritability and in their anxiety becoming increasingly unkind to children, or increasingly withdrawn or dismissive, or perhaps feeling unable to unwind from the day. So it's 3-4 glasses of wine, maybe move on to the scotch, where we are so uncomfortable with the chaos and the fear and the sadness that we are seeking to alleviate those feelings in ways that really are self-destructive to us and destructive to our families. So that's why there's this invitation for presence, even with the hard emotions, because when we try to run from them or when we try to minimize them, we see most of our kind of bad outcomes. So creating language around emotion is a really important thing, where we're naming emotions for ourselves and then helping our kids learn emotional language. I mean, the good old fashioned feeling chart that you can Google, and there's 40 feeling faces and 40 words that go along with it that help us express our feelings so that we aren't feeling stagnant and stuck and then letting those negative emotions out in sideways kinds of strategies that don't help us feel better really, but help us to escape or have sort of an instantaneous relief that's not truly healing or not truly being present. So I think one of the other things that can be really helpful is, in addition to the open discussion about all of this kind of emotion language, is engaging in different family strategies. So one of the things that our family is doing is we're building a shelter in the forest behind our house. And the shelter has branches and sticks, and it has a whole civilization. And it's a creative, playful way for us to, as a family, work out some of this need for protection, need for safety, need for even being outside and being playful. But in the civilization in the forest, there are also scary things. And so we're talking about how to cope with scary things through the context of playing together. So we can't separate, play from fear because it all bumps up against each other. And when we let ourselves sit with that as humans, and then when we are able to observe that and engage with it with our children, I think we're creating emotionally intelligent ways to deal with very, very difficult things. So obviously my comments or my thoughts about this are very context specific. So how we engage with kids or within our families around something like this pandemic really depends on the age of our children, their developmental capacity, their unique needs, some of the history that we're dealing with, their learning needs. There's all kinds of layers of challenge here that we can certainly talk about in some examples when we do some Q&A. But in general, this overarching invitation to lower expectations, take things slowly, develop deep emotional capacity, practice play, be more empathetic than ever before, will, I think, help us to create some of the mental health protective skills that will help us get through this challenge.
Thank you, Sherry. That is really, really helpful. I absolutely love the concept of adding playing with things. And um, you've touched on so many really important topics. So I want to dig into that a little bit. But before I get started, I want to just invite everybody to remember that we've got the Q&A bar below. Make sure to type your questions in. I have seen a couple come through, but if you haven't asked yet, make sure that you get your questions in. We want you to be part of this conversation. So Sherry and I are going to start those questions, but we want yours to come in as well. I love the concept of the question that you talked about. It was, how do we show up for our children, for ourselves, and for those who need us? It's such a big question right now, as we're struggling just to show up for ourselves, not let alone the rest of those individuals. So when we think about mental health and the protecting ourselves, what are the red flags that we should be looking out for? What are the red flags for ourselves, for our children, and even our colleagues? What are the signs that we could be struggling?
Yeah, I think we each have a slightly different red flag portfolio, I should say. But some of the things that I am really watching in the people that I work with is things like alcohol use, which feels so easy because we're home all the time and there's just a lot around. And I'm not anti-alcohol per se, but I think it's a really quick coping mechanism that can quickly become problematic. So that might be something to pay attention to. If you feel like you need a drink every day or multiple drinks every day, that might be something that says, maybe there's something else going on that I'm not quite attending to. Certainly, deep disruption in sleep is often a sign that something's not well inside and can often, coincide with depression or anxiety. So paying attention to whether you're waking up in the middle of the night and unable to stop thinking or feel perseverative worry. You might want to counterbalance something like that with less caffeine or more exercise, things that, are good sleep hygiene practices, but that's often a red flag that something's wrong. Certainly increased irritability, especially in kids. You'll see kids of all ages in their own ways really dig their heels in. I feel like my children have just flat out told me no way more in the last month than since they were 2. I'm like, what is this behavior? But remembering that kind of behavior is a communication of distress. They might be yelling no at me, but really they're yelling no globally at, this sucks. I don't want to do this anymore. And it's, coming out as what we might describe as defiant or rebellious behavior. And of course, we as grownups have our own ways of defiant rebellious behavior where we feel our irritability too. So irritability, especially in kids, is often a sign of depression. It's a sign of sort of existential discontent that they don't quite have language for. So it comes out as no, or, more angry, aggressive behavior.
Great. Yeah, certainly we've all seen that behavior from children as they start to act out. So that's really good insight to know that there's something deeper. It's not just irritability. Often if you dig a little bit deeper, you'll find that there's something, the mental challenges are there.
I think too, sometimes people want to punish it or like eliminate the
Yeah,
behavior.
for
And of
sure.
course, nobody likes to have a kid sort of staring you down saying, no, I won't be doing that. But I really feel like, especially at this time in history, we want to reframe that as communication that I'm not okay. And so the empathetic response of like, I'm really surprised you're talking to me like that. Can you tell me what's going on inside of you?
Yeah.
Those kinds of responses are more helpful now.
Yeah. And, also too, like alcohol use is one of those things that I think, especially to your point, we're all at home. And so it feels like we can have a drink at 3 p.m. and that's okay, on some days.
Sure, sometimes.
But if you find yourself every afternoon at 3 o'clock going to that drink, maybe look at, especially if it's in conjunction with checking the, where the numbers are lying, like
Right.
look at what we're doing. Because I think that there's also that piece to it. It's looking at what's the action, but look at what's motivating that action as well. Right. So
Mm-hmm.
what were you doing just before you had the idea that you should get that drink?
What are you
Or
escaping from?
yeah. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
like I think these are things that while some of it might feel like, oh, I already know that, we just don't observe it in ourselves. And so just having the self-observation, I think, is helpful.
I think because some of these things are also a subtle shift, right? It's not like, okay, quarantine day one, I'm going to day drink. I think you just kind of get there over time if you're not
Yeah.
self-aware. And that's where it can become more problematic.
Yeah. So we've got a couple of questions. Bev was asking, and this is a tough one. What does the dialogue look like when someone passes away during these times? It's hard to grieve by not being able to be with others or having a funeral. And I've heard this from, I myself have had a couple of people pass away in the past, sort of a couple of weeks. Fortunately, not people very close to me, but still watching this for those people who were close to them, and imagining what it could be like. It's a very difficult thing. So what do you suggest on that?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that's so painful and difficult about the current situation is that we can't gather. And funerals, rituals, things around grief are really important psychological functions, right? Where we have the opportunity to name the person who's been lost, to tell stories, to trade memories, to enter into the emotional space with other people. The communalization of grief is one of the things that is most important and most helpful in helping people move through it. So, it's absolutely not ideal. It's not my first choice, but I am grateful to have things like Zoom where we can still gather people. We can gather family members. We can take the initiative to say, hey, we lost Aunt Susie the other day. We can't get together, but let's still gather virtually and swap some stories and share some memories and sort of check in emotionally. That's something that's always going to be important is that shift from the loss living inside of you alone to the loss being shared with other people.
Yeah, I mean, it is helpful. And I think, even when we're not grieving, the fact that we can't gather, we're grieving that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I know many people are having, the virtual get-togethers, the teas in the afternoon, with people over Zoom, and it's helpful. But it still is challenging. I'm a hugger. I don't get to
Yes.
hug anyone anymore. And so that lack of touching is really, really difficult. So I think we're all in a place of grief, even when we've lost a lot, even if it isn't close family members or friends.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Melanie has a question around practicing gratitude. She says, and I love this, she said, we practice gratitude by talking about it and dropping off flowers to loved ones. But what else can we do to practice gratitude?
Mm. Well, so many things. I mean, I think for your own individual well-being, a gratitude journal is, of course, one of our strongest mental health interventions. So simply naming those things for yourself, writing them down, looking back over them over time. And then if there are spaces and ways to share those with family members or even people virtually, to decide that those are the thoughts that you're going to put into your mind. And I think you're right, Melanie, in identifying that that gratitude that lives inside of you then spills over into other people. So whether that's chalk art on your sidewalk that is expressing gratitude or expressing love or well wishes to your neighbors, or it's dropping off food or flowers or other things for other people, or even the way you show up on social media. I think that, there's certainly those of us who have really been mindful of how do you put some positive, kind of loving, grateful messages into the world. It's so important because in the midst of all of the fearfulness, there's still lots of things to be grateful for. And I think when we let ourselves ask that question, we can find lots of those things.
Gratitudes are so incredibly important. Like you said, regardless of whether we're in the midst of a global pandemic as we are today, or whether it's just our daily lives. I know I have a group of friends who we text gratitudes to each other daily. And it's just a way that we start our day. And it's a nice little thing. In the mornings as I'm having my coffee, I'll get a text from one of them with a list of gratitudes. And it's a lovely reminder of that, look, we live in incredibly fortunate times. Yeah. And we each have so much to be grateful for, even when we're challenged.
Yeah.
So I personally find gratitudes to be something that are incredibly important. There's a couple of things that you said that I want to dig a little deeper into. One was this idea, the shelter that you're building in your backyard. First of all, what a beautiful thing to do with your family. Mm-hmm. And I'm jealous, living in the city and not having a backyard, not being able to go out and play with twigs and sticks. But listening to that, it struck me that it was such a metaphor, the physical building of a shelter, mm-hmm. in the metaphor for safety and protection. And talk to me a little bit about maybe some of the conversations I can imagine that must come out of the time that you're together with your family doing that.
Yeah, I think one of the drivers of anxiety for all of us is the sense in which something bad is happening and we can't do anything about it. And I think that the ability to, even through a play or an imaginal way, even with the stuffed animals, right? These are kids deciding like, oh, I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to protect my stuffy so they don't get infected. The shelter is really, is very much like that, where, and it's on public land, by the way. So it's just in this sort of wooded area near where we live in Minnesota. And interestingly, when we started building our shelter, there are now 2 other shelters in the forest. And so we left notes for those shelter builders. I don't know what their background is or story, but having the project to do together is, a huge part of it. Having a way to play together, having a thing to talk about, but also it's the can-do-ness of it. Like, we can build this. We can make a place that feels safe, even if it's safe in our imaginary world. And that sense of agency is a really powerful counterbalance to the depression of hopelessness or helplessness. So even if it's in a playful way, finding spaces to exert your own agency is really, really helpful in times like this.
Oh, I love that. And, and you're right. You're reminding me that, look, I may live in a condo in a city, but that doesn't mean that there isn't outdoor space that I can, safely self-isolate from, but still to have my own little impact on creating my own shelter, even if it's temporary, and creating, like maybe my daughter and I can go and play a little bit in it, so I love that. That is, I think, really helpful, because so many of us, don't have that easy access to a backyard. And so even that as a strategy is really, really helpful.
Well, I'm even looking at all of the beautiful plants behind you and thinking about you can tend your plants. That can be your little contribution to I'm making something beautiful, I'm keeping something alive, I'm nurturing something. Maybe make a little fairy garden in one of your house plants. That's still its own generative, creative, agency-filled activity.
And my daughter, who is listening right now, I know is laughing because these are all her plants, and she's probably saying, "See, Mom, I told you the house plants are good." And I do, I love house plants, but I'm the worst at keeping them alive. So again, thank you.
There's a quarantine practice for you. She
Exactly.
can mentor you in plant maintenance.
You also talked, and I love the concept of the emotion chart. Giving us language around emotions, and that by the way, I didn't know that there was such a thing. So I think I might be downloading the feeling chart for myself.
Yeah.
But it's helpful because I think it is again a challenge. We typically are face to face on so many things, and so we get used to reading each other through so many different body language cues that we're not even aware of. But facial expressions is one of those things that we don't often take a lot of notice of. Like we see each other's faces and we assume certain things.
Mm.
And so when we're over video, because suddenly we're all over video, and the face is often the only thing we really are seeing. You can see it from the shoulders up, right? Face and shoulders. And so we're not getting any of those other bodily cues. You're not getting the set of the body or the set of, the tilt of the hip, which are all little things that we just don't even pay attention to, but our brain does.
Right.
And so this idea of what our face is saying, help us to maybe dig into that a little bit more around how we can through video, because we're all here more,
Mm-hmm.
um, pay more attention with our colleagues on what might be going on with them.
Mm. Yeah, I actually really love doing teletherapy or remote therapy because you do have such a lock on someone's face. It's such a focal point. And of course, the rest of the nonverbals are incredibly important, and we are losing access to that data. But I think really looking at someone's face is its own sort of powerful way to really see someone. I think faces tell a lot. Eyes tell a lot. Body posture, of course, tells a lot. But more generally, I hope that we are feeling with our colleagues the freedom and the space to check in on the emotional level more often than maybe we would have otherwise. To say, hey, I've been worried about you. I've been thinking about you. How's this going for you, really? Um, because even on video, it's, we can put on a happy face and throw that lipstick on and be ready to rock and roll and be really hurting or struggling inside. So I think you can see a lot of that in someone's face, but there's a lot you can't see, and you just have to ask more directly than maybe we've had to before.
Mm.
So I would love to give global permission to pry more than before. We don't have to be quite so respectful of everyone's privacy because we can ask more.
Thank you. That's amazing. So this will be our last question.
Yeah.
With all this togetherness, we're all together in our homes a lot. And too much togetherness can be tough, and especially on relationships. So do you have any tips for staying romantically connected in the midst of all of this stress?
Yeah, it's challenging because I think, again, at least in my house, we're tag teaming like never before, right? It's like you have this 3 hours to work. I have these 3 hours to work. Don't bother me. I won't bother you. You get the kids. I got the kids. It's just like, whoa, it's a lot of trading. So I think to intentionally create spaces where the logistics are turned off. And, we can do date night at home, just like we can do date night in a beautiful restaurant. Finding ways to enjoy walks together, to really continue to tune into the emotional well-being of our partners. Again, I think when we're doing logistics all the time, it can be easy to have a very transactional relationship. And that's okay. But most of us are also longing for deeper connection, and especially in a time of greater fear and anxiety, the invitation to be physically connected, the need to be more emotionally attuned, is greater now than ever. And I am in those ways grateful for the slowness, right? We're less busy than we've been before. So hopefully we can take advantage of some of that time to really check in on our partners and have some bigger conversations about what we're feeling and what we're learning during the season.
Yeah, thank you. That's I think that's sage advice for many of the couples out there is don't forget that you can still have that virtual date night. You can
Mm-hmm.
still connect. And it's important because to your point, with all the transactions that we've got to manage throughout the day, because that's what's happened with children and work and schedules. It's all transactional. And remembering that relationships are not transactional.
Yeah.
Relationships really are about that deep, deep connection. And so on some level, just reconnecting with that person at least once a day, to make sure that the transactions haven't impacted the connection.
Right. Tenderness and empathy for ourselves, for our partners, for our kids, for our colleagues. A little bit of softness, I think, is really helpful.
Well, thank you so much, Sherry. This has been absolutely a pleasure. What a great conversation. Um, I'm hoping and I know that you will be back next week. I think you're back on Thursday to answer some more questions. So we'll put it out there to all of our participants to say, if you didn't get your questions answered or if you weren't able to get it into that chat box, save it. We've got Sherry coming back to talk more with us about not only, sorry, not only these relationships, but also all of the other aspects of mental health and how it's affecting you as we move through this global pandemic. So with that, just a couple of housekeeping things I want to remind you. We're back on Tuesday with our Changemaker 20 series, which is, of course, 20 minutes with a changemaker and an Ask Me Anything style. On Tuesday, we've got Ozioma Iganawanu, who is going to be speaking with us about leadership during this time. On Wednesday, we have Dr. Zaina Kayat, who many of you joined us on Tuesday of this week with. Zaina is going to continue on looking at the future of healthcare and answering your questions. And then on Thursday, we've got Dr. Sherry Walling continuing on in the area of mental health and how we can take care of ourselves, our families, and our coworkers through these challenging times. And then on Friday, we have another sense-making conversation with Dr. Mary Donahue, who's going to help us to achieve 76 more really good days, which I'm really interested in hearing more about. So thank you again for joining us today. This is Sense Making Conversations. I'm Andrea Sampson, the CEO of Talk Boutique. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay connected. Thank you so much.